Welcome, everybody. Today is Tuesday, February 22nd, and on Tuesdays we have Mr. Dwoskin presenting his In the Headline lecture series. So, Mr. Dwoskin, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Angela. For people who are super into numbers and things like that, you all probably realize that today is 22-2-22-22. So you've got like 7 twos all in a row, and the second month, the 22nd day of the second month of 2022. So we'll have to wait 1111 more years before we get to 3333. So, enjoy it while you can, because you ain't going to see the 3333. Because of this week's news events, I decided to speak again about let's now call it some kind of a war in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine. And I know I spoke last time, a couple of weeks ago, about Ukraine itself and the history of the country. And today I want to just concentrate on the actual sort of situation and the immediate antecedents of that, as well as speaking about the method or the strategy that Putin has in carrying out his foreign policy. As I was saying, Putin has been in power now since the year 2000. So he's actually been in power in Russia for 22 years. Russia, as an independent sort of non-communist country, only started 9 years before that. So pretty well for the most of the life of the new Russia, because Russia's name was changed as a country only in 1991, Putin has been in power for most of it, either as president or prime minister. He gamed the system, because let's say the president was only allowed to serve 2 terms. He then became prime minister, and then he went back to being president because he could start all over again. So he is definitely a force to be reckoned with, and the world is now standing up and watching and waiting and trying to figure out where this all may end, and what the world, both friend of Russia and foe of Russia, what should they do about it? So what happened yesterday was that Russia recognized the so-called People's Republic of Donetsk and the People's Republic of Luhansk. So I'm sure none of you have ever heard of these People's Republics. They don't exist in any formal way recognized by any other country except Russia. They're not members of any World Trade Organization or the United Nations or anything else in Europe. These are parts, about one third of 2 Ukrainian provinces of the same name. And these 2 provinces in the Ukraine are located in the far eastern part of the country, bordering with Russia. The so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk are the easternmost parts of these 2 easternmost provinces in the Ukraine. So they're touching Russia, and just the names People's Republic that they call themselves, of course, harks back to the days of the Soviet Union, when you had the People's Republic of just about every Soviet state that there was. People's Republic of Lithuania and the People's Republic of Ukraine and etc. So People's Republic in those times meant that they were controlled by the Communist Party, and the sort of people who took control there under Russian supervision just liked the idea of having a People's Republic because it sounds good, and that's how they named those places. how they became to be people's republics is that Putin sent in Russian militia and sort of off the books Russian soldiers to start a revolution against the Ukraine, to find local militia in the areas to fight with them. And they then took over power and declared themselves to be a people's republic. So it wasn't as if something happened organically from those places by themselves. It was Russia that started it by sending Russian troops over the border, but not wearing Russian uniforms, disguised as private, so-called what would you call them? Private insurgents, something like that. All the weapons, of course, in this insurgency came from Russia. All the leadership came from there. So pretty well, Russia ended up taking over the eastern part of the two easternmost provinces in the Ukraine. The original plan probably was to take over the whole provinces, but the Ukrainian military and the army fought back pretty hard. And Russia did not feel it was worthwhile at that point to spend extra lives and money to take over the whole provinces. Now, previous to that, these provinces on the easternmost part of the Ukraine were Russian-speaking as opposed to Ukrainian-speaking. During the period of democracy in the Ukraine, they all voted for the Russian-speaking party running for elections in the Ukraine. And at certain points, this Russian-speaking party did win the whole election in the Ukraine, and its leader became the president of the country. Of course, under that circumstance, Mr. Putin was very happy to have what we might call a stooge in power in Ukraine. And that sort of fulfills his dream or his vision of having a kind of a united front of the three Slavic republics, namely Belarus, Russia, and the Ukraine, all under the Russian leadership or under the Russian control. So right now he has the Belarus under his own control because, of course, he saved Mr. Lukashenko from being thrown out during the revolution last year. While Mr. Yanukovych was in power in the Ukraine, he actually sort of had his dream come true. But, you know, as we'll say later on, this Mr. Yanukovych, the Russian-speaking president of the Ukraine, was tossed out. He fled to Russia, and the opposition took over, which were much more Ukrainian nationalists and against Russian influence in the Ukraine. The people, though, who were living in those provinces never wanted to be taken over by Russia. So their situation was that they were, so long as they were a sort of a protected minority in the Ukraine, and so long as the border was open with Russia, they didn't necessarily want to be taken over by Russia. The reason being that the Ukraine was a democratic country. The Ukraine was a country which had ties to Europe, and you know, Russia was not a democratic country, and Russia was a place where you could get put in jail for saying the wrong thing or for insulting the wrong person, etc. So basically, that was the situation until the invasion happened. It was in some of the key kind of year, the key year of this whole little drama here was in 2014, because that's when there was the overthrow of the Russian-speaking pro-Russian president in Ukraine. And in that same year, not uncoincidentally, Russia took over the Crimean Peninsula from the Ukraine. So this is in a completely different area. The Crimean Peninsula was part of the Ukraine until Russia completely annexed it in 2014. That peninsula is located in the Black Sea. It's the Ukraine's only access to the sea, and it's Russia's only warm water access to the sea. As opposed to the annexation in eastern Ukraine, when Russia took over Crimea, by and large, the people were in favor of it. The area there was more than 80% Russian speaking. And Crimea as a whole was never historically Ukrainian. There were almost no Ukrainians living there, and it had no historical ties to Ukraine at all. In the Crimean Peninsula, it was a Muslim-ruled sort of state until the Russian Empire took it over in the 1700s. And the Crimea was only transferred to the Ukraine in 1954 when Khrushchev was the Secretary General of the Communist Party, and he wanted to do something to sort of win over the Ukrainians' loyalty after the Second World War. So Russia did sort of two annexations, one of the Crimea, and the other one of the those parts of those provinces in eastern Ukraine. So they expanded in sort of two directions, and both times against the Ukraine itself, taking territory from the Ukraine. When this takeover occurred, the one in the Ukraine anyway, almost all the people stayed, and the only people who left were the main group of people who left the Crimea were the Muslim minority who was there, who had always been suspect by the Soviet authorities, and so they moved into the Ukraine, as refugees. When Russia took over those two republics, Luhansk and Donetsk, there were many Ukrainians who moved west because, and this would include both Russian speakers and non-Russian speakers, simply because they didn't want to live on the front lines anymore. Those areas were sort of still unstable. There was sort of military actions going on all the time. Some Russian-speaking people went to Russia. The Russian government gave hundreds of thousands of them Russian passports, so they were able to go to live in Russia. And other ones went to the Ukraine and had family there. And still other ones just stayed to where they were until this very day in those sort of people's republics, we'll call them, of Donetsk and Luhansk. As I said, that the ones who left to go to Ukraine were people who appreciated the democracy in the Ukraine, even though by and large the sort of standard of living in the economy was better in Russia than it was in the Ukraine. There were many people who said, you know what, we value our freedom more than we value a few extra dollars a month for our pensions. And so many of them left to move to other Russian-speaking parts of the Ukraine, like the big city of Kharkov, which is the biggest Russian-speaking city in the Ukraine. 1.5 million people were displaced by the fighting in those small little territories. So they moved one direction or another. And so it was really quite quite a significant event in the lives of the people there. The invasion, of course, in 2014 also pushed the Ukraine closer to the West. In other words, the Ukraine is afraid, and still is afraid, that Russia might take over the whole place. And so, there's always been two directions in Ukrainian politics, one toward the East and one toward the West. But this invasion really pushed people toward the West, towards wanting to become members of NATO, to have a sort of a collective security agreement. And naturally, Russia doesn't want that, because they say, well, if Ukraine joins with NATO, then it means that the West is on the Russian doorstep. But it was Russia's own doing that pushed them in that direction. Now, let's just go back a little bit to see where the roots of the problem come from. And of course, when the Tsar was in power back, before 1917, and there was no democracy, the Russian government really didn't care about minority rights, and they didn't care about what people thought of them. And when the Soviet Revolution happened, it didn't happen overnight. It took the Soviets 3 or 4 years to consolidate their power. And in the meantime, they tried to win some kind of public support from the people that they were ruling. And especially this was for where people were not Russian. So in other words, when the Tsars were in power, they imposed the Russian language, and they even imposed the Russian Orthodox religion on all of their subjects. And the Soviet Union tried to contrast that. They said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to recognize the sort of ethnic and religious, no, not religious, but the ethnic and the linguistic differences among all the different components of the Soviet Union in order to create sort of support for the revolution. And so when the Soviet Union was created, they created 15 and later 16 so-called republics. That's where they got this name, People's Republic of Luhansk. So the Soviets created 15 and later 16 republics, which somehow or other, the sound of it sounded as if they were all independent, just joining with the Soviet Union voluntarily, which of course was not the case. They were really, we'll call them provinces that were centrally governed from the Moscow, with a kind of a veneer of national self-government in every capital of those different republics. So, they were called Soviet Socialist Republics, but they weren't Soviet, they weren't socialist, and they weren't republics. So Soviet, it means, run by a local council, which they weren't. Socialist, they were not socialist, they were communist. And republic, they weren't a republic because they weren't self-governing, they weren't independent. And so, in a certain way, the whole union of Soviet Socialist republics was all sort of a fiction imposed by the Communist Party there. Just like the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, they used to say it's not German, it wasn't democratic, and it wasn't a republic. Same idea, basically. But by giving recognition to local cultures and languages under communism, they gave people a sense of identity that they didn't have under the Tsarist regime. But the religious part of that identity, that definitely was put down. So the communists didn't want any kind of alternate source of power from the people, from their religious authorities, whether they were even Russian Orthodox or obviously Muslim or Jewish or other Christian. They just about closed all the different churches, and the ones they left open were completely suborned by the Communist Party, and the church officials that worked there, their loyalty was to the Communist Party in the first place, and that's how they managed to run those republics for all those years that they were around. Now, when Stalin took over in 1924, so remember that the Soviet Union was created in 1917, and there were really 3 years of civil war, and things really didn't settle down until 1921. But Lenin died in 1924, so really Stalin was the sort of founder, in a certain sense, of the communist system of government in the Soviet Union. And he had a very interesting strategy of adjusting borders. And he wanted to adjust the borders of the different republics and even of the sort of sub-provinces inside those republics to make sure that they were not ethnically homogeneous. So he didn't want the idea, for example, that all the Ukrainians in the country should be in the Ukraine. Or let's say, for example, all the Uzbeks in Uzbekistan should be in Uzbekistan, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So he always made sure when the boundaries were drawn that there was within each republic, there were strong minorities. And outside of those republics, there were the minorities that could have been in the republics, but they were left outside. And that was to ensure loyalty, and if necessary, to create tensions within those republics should any problems arise. Stalin also had his favorites and non-favorite places. Unfortunately for the Ukrainians, Ukraine was considered to be non-favorite by Stalin. This was always because of the sort of fear that the Ukrainians would not be completely loyal to the Soviet Union. The resistance by the Ukrainians to the communism was very strong after they took over. What he did was, in that sense, was he drew the boundaries of the Ukraine to include these Russian-speaking areas, so that if ever problems would arise with Ukrainian nationalism, he could always mobilize those Russian speakers against the Ukrainian sort of leadership, which is exactly what this plan worked out, but it didn't work for Stalin, it worked for Putin. But the plan was dreamed up by Stalin back in the 1920s and 30s, just to give you an idea of sort of how it ended up in that way. Now, Georgia, the Georgian Republic, was one of Stalin's favorites, obviously, because he himself was Georgian, although he had a lot of differences with the sort of, we'll call it the local Georgian leadership, and certainly with the Georgian church. So what he did was he added some parts to Georgia that didn't have Georgian in them. And that later turned out to be kind of a gold mine, again, for Mr. Putin. In Central Asia, there were lots of minorities that were spread around the different republics. And for example, Kazakhstan was a republic that had only 40% Kazakhs living in there, and other peoples, including Russians, formed the rest of the people. That was the whole idea, to mix things up, to create possible, let's say, areas of loyal people against the majority, or of having majority people against minorities. It was a way to sort of balance things out and hold control. And that was the plan that was dreamed up by Stalin way back when. At the end of the Second World War, Ukraine was expanded because Poland, the country of Poland, was taken over. The whole eastern part of Poland was taken over by the Ukrainians, and the Poland's borders expanded westward to take over parts of Germany. So Poland kind of moved. The country, the borders moved. The country is still there, but the borders is the Poland, pre-war Poland is not the same as post-war Poland. So, for example, the city of Lvov, or Lviv as they call it, today is in the Ukraine, but was once one of the major cities in eastern Poland. And today it's a major city in Western Ukraine. When Ukraine was expanded after the Second World War, all those territories in the western part that were added into the Ukraine were never part of the Soviet system or the communist system. So the people who lived there only became Soviet citizens sort of after 1945. And needless to say, their roots were in the Ukrainian nationalism. Many of them resisted the Soviet invasion of the Ukraine, as a counteroffensive to the Germans. There were some Ukrainians that fought with the Germans against the Soviets in 1944 when the Soviets counterattacked. And in addition, many of these Western Ukrainians were Catholics because when Poland was ruling the territory, they sort of imposed Catholicism or introduced Catholicism to the upper classes who became Ukrainian Catholics. Everyone in Western Ukraine spoke Ukrainian and not Russian. So in that way, there was a natural division in the Ukraine between starting in the far west, the most anti-Russian group, and then starting in the far east, the most pro-Russian group, and in the middle, which is Kiev, the capital, was kind of a mixed between the two sides. The tactic of using sort of local pro-Russian militias didn't start in the Ukraine. It actually started in Georgia. That's why I spoke about that to start with. So in 2003, there was what was called a Rose Revolution in Georgia. So Georgia is a province or one of the republics of the former Soviet Union in the Caucasus Mountains and on the Black Sea. So Georgia is part of the three Caucasus republics, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. And the leader of Georgia after the independence and the Soviet Union broke apart was the same leader who was in charge of Georgia before that, Mr. Shevardnadze. He was probably one of the number 2 men in the Soviet Union under Brezhnev. And he took over the country when the Soviet Union broke apart. In the 8 years of independence, Georgia did not advance much. Of course, all the lives in all of the former Soviet republics fell. The standard of living fell. Russia is the same thing. They all, things fell apart. Factories closed. Jobs were lost. People didn't know what to do. There was no sort of investment to get the countries moving again. Often sort of political leaders and other oligarchs took over any of the resources that were left in the country and kept it for themselves. So, it took 10 years when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 for things to start to slowly climb back to even the level that they were before the Soviet Union fell apart. And Mr. Shevardnadze, like many of his colleagues, tried to hold on to power as much as he could. And when they had elections, he tried to manipulate the elections just the way Mr. Lukashenko did of the Belarus, last year. And people just revolted after one of these fake elections in 2003. The opposition brought roses to the parliament, and that's why they call it the Rose Revolution. The army was called on by Shevardnadze to put down the revolution, but they refused. And so a pro-Western government was installed. Now, what happened after that was that Russia was, of course, extremely unhappy with this revolution. And the small area that was given over to Georgia by Stalin, the Russians used that area to start a war against Georgia. They, in other words, they sent militias in. They said, well, this area doesn't want to be part of the new Georgia. And they used the same playbook as they used in the eastern the eastern provinces of the Ukraine. A war broke out. Georgia lost. The two regions became controlled by Russia. Russia recognized and was the only country who recognized the independence of these two regions. And that's what happened. And all of this happened when Putin took over in 2000. So these wars were started shortly after that. One was in 2003, one was in 2008. They created fake people's militias backed with Russian weapons and Russian soldiers not in uniform. So this was the sort of Georgia, we'll call it template or example of how to infiltrate a neighbor by using local supporters of Russia to sort of invite the Russian forces into the country. Now, another area of conflict, another area that's just like this, where conflict hasn't quite broken out yet, is a place called Transnistria. And Transnistria is part of the country called Moldova, which in itself is another whole story of a kind of an artificial country. But Moldova was one of the Soviet republics at the time. So when the Soviet Union broke apart, Moldova, by definition, became an independent country. But Moldova, which is the smallest and poorest part of the Soviet Empire, it's right on the border with Romania. And the people who live in Moldova are Romanian-speaking people. But there is a river that runs kind of in the eastern part of the country, the Dnistria River. And on the other side of that river are Russian-speaking people who moved there somehow, through the Tsarist years. And this part of the country did not want to be part of Moldova at all. And they declared their independence from Moldova when Moldova became an independent country. Now, of course, Russia recognized this so-called independence, the independent Republic of Transnistria. And up until for years, in other words, for 30 odd years, it's been this kind of an island in a way, where Russians send their forces, where they use the Russian money, where they speak Russian. And on one side of this country is Moldova, and on the other side is Ukraine. So it's almost like a Russian enclave in the middle of Southern Europe, where there's a huge amount of Russian forces now stationed. So when you look at how Ukraine is surrounded by the Russian troops, you have the Russian troops, of course, on the east. In north of Ukraine is Belarus, and Putin sent thousands and thousands of troops into Belarus practically without asking the president of Belarus. And certainly the president welcomed those troops because it was Putin who saved him from his own revolution. So on the north side and on the east side, Russian troops are there. But now on the west side, where Transnistria is another deployment of Russian troops. So in a certain sense, Ukraine is almost surrounded on all sides. The very bottom is the Black Sea, where the Russians have all kinds of naval forces over there. So in a certain, strategic sense, Ukraine is surrounded by Russians. By the way, the sort of agreement to end the battle, the hostilities in Georgia, was mediated by the French President Sarkozy. Just like now, Mr. Macron, the French president, is trying to kind of mediate the dispute in the Ukraine. So there are some kind of enduring themes of this conflict. One of the themes is that Russia sees itself as the country who has to protect the interests of Russian minorities wherever they are. Russian people, wherever they are, Russian people who are on the borders with the former, with Russia, a part of the former Soviet Union. So during the time the Soviet Union existed, and even before, Russian-speaking people moved from Russia all over the place in order to pursue sort of better lives. They moved to Central Asia. They moved to the Caucasus republics. They moved west into the Ukraine, and they also moved to the Baltic republics. So all of these places had significant Russian-speaking minorities, and during the time that the communists were in power, these minorities were, if not in charge of those republics, they were very powerful behind the scenes. When these republics became independent, of course, the Russian speakers lost their backing from Moscow, and many of them left and went back home, depending on their own individual situation. And many, of course, stayed where they were and just tried to make a new life in these new independent countries. But this idea of protecting Russians living outside of the country is the sort of rationale that Putin is using to invade these places. In the first place, the so-called defend the rights of these Russian people. That's the explanation or rationalization of this whole thing. Now, significantly, in Latvia and in Estonia, the two Baltic republics, there's huge Russian-speaking minorities. People who came to live there, both before communism and after communism. And these were people who basically ran those places under the Soviet Union. But Latvia and Estonia are part of NATO. They have a democracy. They have a much higher standard of living than Russia has. And the Russian people who live there, they want their rights as an ethnic minority, but they certainly don't want Russia to take them over. But needless to say, the leaders and the citizens of those republics are afraid that Russia will use the Russian minorities there as an excuse to invade and take over those places. Kazakhstan is another country with a large Russian-speaking minority. When it became independent, it was 40% Kazakh and 37% Russian. And of course, many of the Russians left after independence because they would, they sort of automatically became I won't call them second-class citizens, but they became not the power source in the new country. But the president of Kazakhstan was very sort of intelligent at that time. And what he did was he paid Kazakhs living elsewhere to come to live in Kazakhstan. So this was a kind of let's say, a demographic strategy to fill Kazakhstan with more Kazakhs so that the Russians would be outnumbered. And he did this by offering housing and offering school and offering other privileges to Kazakhs who would move, including Kazakhs who were living in China, which has still a large Kazakh minority living in the Xinjiang province. You know, we know of the Uyghurs, how they were the majority in the province, but there were always a large amount of Kazakhs living there also. And then not only did the president of Kazakhstan bring them there, but he settled them in the areas where there were Russians living. So the Russians were living in the north part. He settled these newcomers in the north part. And so today there are only 17 or 18% of Russians living in Kazakhstan. And, you know, he was thinking in advance that the Russians might try to pull the same trick that they're pulling in the Ukraine to sort of protect the Russian-speaking people. So by getting rid of the Russians and outnumbering them, it gives the Russians less excuse to try to invade. One of the ironies of this story is that when the Ukraine became independent, it had nuclear weapons that were put there by the Soviet Union. And the world, you know, asked the Ukraine to give up these weapons, and they did. They gave all the nuclear weapons up, but it was on condition that their sort of liberty and independence would be guaranteed both by Russia and guaranteed by the West. So now those guarantees are looking, you know, a little shaky because Russia itself is the one who is aggressing over in the Ukraine. And for sure, the West does not want to start a war with Russia. The Ukraine is not part of NATO. There's no treaty that says that the West has to go and protect the Ukraine. And that's one big reason why I don't think the Ukraine would ever become part of NATO, because, you know, the West would know that they would have to commit themselves to fight against Russia should events ever deteriorate in that way. The so-called sanctions that the West is putting on Russia are really more a formality than anything else. Russia has an enormous amount of foreign exchange that they've saved up during the period when oil and gas prices were high, which is sort of now. Russia has a world open market to sell their oil and gas. Really, their two biggest exports. I mean, in general, Russia's exports are all raw materials. So it's not just oil and gas, but nickel, aluminum, and wheat. And they have very little sort of high-tech exports and really very little sort of industrial manufactured type exports. So it's raw materials, raw grains, metals, etc. And, you know, there's a world market for this kind of thing. And China is, of course, the biggest consumer of these products. China has no oil of its own and almost no gas of its own. And there's pipelines that are running directly now from Russia into China via the Central Asian republics. And, Germany said that they would not accept a Russian gas pipe through the new Nord Stream pipeline, the pipeline that the Russians built at a cost of billions, running from Russia directly to Germany under the Baltic Sea. And Russia did this in order to avoid the sort of problem of paying other countries for transit fees, countries like the Ukraine or Belarus, to transport the gas into Western Europe. So by building an undersea pipeline, they avoided all of these middlemen, each raking off a percentage. And Germany, on its part, was very happy to receive Russian gas. Germany is the largest country in Europe outside of Russia, industrialized country. They need all the energy. They again have, besides having some very low quality coal, they have no oil or gas of their own. And so this was sort of a win-win in a way for both countries. But in order to stand with their allies, Germany said they would not allow the pipeline to open. I just got a flash on my thing saying the Russians have sent soldiers there into the Ukraine, and I think Putin announced that he was going to send soldiers in order to sort of defend those places, keep the peace, etc. He was sending peacekeeping soldiers to a place where he started a war in the first place. So the sanctions which were announced on banks have become a lot more important than the sanctions on a few individuals or on Russian oil or gas, because the banks are the way that countries transact business and the way trade is carried out and the way money is exchanged. And should there be a sort of a boycott of Russian banks and Russian transfer facilities, that would make life a little more complicated for Russia. Of course, money always talks. The Chinese have their own banks. The Chinese have offered the Russians to use Chinese money, the yuan, as a means of foreign exchange. It's not the easiest thing in the world to change Chinese money, but it's not that difficult either. So Russia does have its backup plans, should sanctions really take hold. But remember that sanctions are a two-way street. So if the Europeans put sanctions on Russia, they lose out because they need Russia for many different things, including its energy sources, and also Russians as customers for European goods. So it's, starting a sort of an economic war sometimes ends up with both sides losing and no side winning. This is kind of something that the European powers are going to have to sort of figure out step by step and manage to make their way there. Now, the United States is sort of seen as the biggest counterpoint to Russia. The United States has been in a period of isolationism for sure since Trump took over. Trump's basic belief was that the United States should not be involved anywhere in the world where it would cost the US money, or anywhere in the world where the US does not have an immediate advantage for being there. And certainly there's consensus in the United States that they should not be sort of the first boots on the ground to go and confront Putin in the Ukraine. That being the case, then, the Europeans on their own are not going to go into the fight a war against Russia in the Ukraine. And so Putin realizes he has the upper hand here. And it's just a question of, how will the rest of the world respond? The sort of question is, the Russian people were in favor on the whole of the takeover of the Crimean Peninsula from the Ukraine. But I'm not so sure that the Russian people would be in favor of sort of a long drawn out pitched battle between Ukrainian forces and Russian forces in the middle of winter over a kind of sort of, we'll call it, I won't say it's not strategic, but Russia is so big, it's the world's biggest country already. Why would the people of Russia see it necessary to take over more territory and make an enemy on its borders? So it's, and not only that, but Putin today, having been in power for 22 years, has sort of worn out his welcome. And the proof of that is by arresting Mr. Navalny and closing any kind of critical media sources. He's proving how vulnerable he is and how weak he feels himself. So the Russian people would not automatically support him in this sort of an adventure that might end up ending badly for Russia, certainly if Russian troops start coming home dead. And if the standard of living ends up getting cut. But as I said, Russia has so much buffer, they've got so much money in foreign reserves that they can kind of wait out a medium-term boycott of Russia simply by using up some of their foreign reserves to buy whatever they happen to need. So the pundits are saying what would the results of this sort of instability cause, and we already know that the world markets have taken a big drop since the tensions started going up in the Ukraine. The stock markets, certainly in the US and Canada, have dropped from their highs in the very beginning of January till now. They must be down close to somewhere around 10%. There's a possibility that the prices of oil and gas are going to go up, because if Russian supplies are not available to Western Europe, then Western Europe has to buy it from somewhere else, namely the US or Africa. And this extra demand will push up the prices for everybody. So at a time of rising inflation, when you jump the cost of one very key ingredient, namely oil, which is used for transportation, so everything that's bought in our country and all around the world is brought there by somehow, by air, by plane, by ship, by truck, by etc. So raising the price of transportation raises the price of goods. So adding to the inflation, which is already let's say serious and nerve-wracking, jumping the price of transportation would even add fuel to the fire, let's say. But there doesn't seem to be, as is interesting, so interesting that the United States itself is such a divided country, and yet on this particular issue of world importance, probably the most international tension the world has had since quite a long time, there doesn't seem to be any kind of real significant difference between the Republicans and the Democrats in the United States. They both want the US to confront Russia, but they don't want the US to actually lose any soldiers' lives, or even to make economic sacrifices in order to punish Russia. So, I think we're in for a period of tension. I think that at some point or other, this will get resolved. What Russia wants out of this is for the Ukraine to recognize its closeness to Russia, its dependence on Russia, for Ukraine to never join NATO, for Ukraine to re-engage with this troika of Slavic states, namely, as I was mentioning before, Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, that the three countries under Russian guidance would sort of form one trading bloc, one political bloc, and Russia would be the boss of all those places. Russia would love to install a pro-Russian dictator in the Ukraine on the model of Lukashenko in Belarus. And he just hasn't found anybody yet who's, the last guy got kicked out and ran away. So they haven't come up with anybody else, but I'm sure they're grooming people, looking at people, plotting, and figuring out how they can install one of their stooges in power in Kiev. The Ukrainian people are ready to fight the Russians. Their army seems to be much more better prepared, but of course, overall, way weaker in terms of amounts of weapons and planes and everything else. But they seem to be determined to fight and not to surrender. So it's so ironic that the president of Russia, Mr. Zelensky, happens to be Jewish and happens to be quite popular. And again, maybe part of this whole invention of this tension is the fact that Mr. Zelensky was not able to be bought by Russia. He wasn't corrupt. He wasn't a power-hungry politician, and on the mold of the previous presidents of Russia, of the Ukraine, sorry. And so Russia found that they couldn't deal with him in the usual way, and so things just went from bad to worse in that sense. So I think pretty well that's an up-to-date explanation of these. Of this situation, and for people who are interested, if you're reading the Israeli press, you have a population in Israel of hundreds of thousands of both Russians and Ukrainians living in the same country, and so far they haven't faced off against each other. Although the Ukrainians there feel more pro-Ukrainian and the Russians feel more pro-Russian, but they haven't faced off against each other, abroad. And it's just such an interesting phenomenon there. So I'm going to, let me take my watch, yeah. I'm going to stop and see if you have any comments, questions about this. I can just add, of course, we all know that the blockade that we spoke about last time, is more or less ended peacefully, that there was nobody killed, that there was no shootings, there were no looting, no vandalism, no arson. It was, I would say, as Canadian, a standoff as you could get. People were politely asked to move, and they didn't move. They got a law passed. The police used the law, gave plenty of warning, did as minimal damage as they could. People were arrested but left out on bail, except for that one Tamara Leach who's still in jail. So all in all, it was a pretty peaceful Canadian conflict, and that's the way conflict should take place, in a certain way. So yeah, if you got comments or questions, I'm ready to hear you.
I don't see anybody yet, Mr. Dwoskin. We'll give them a minute or two.
Yeah, sure. Let people, take a breath, take a sip of coffee if they're drinking any. It's amazing under this format that you could do two things at the same time. You could be reading, you could be, like I said, drinking coffee, eating, and at the same time enjoying a lesson all at the same time. And again, of course, like I often do, I repeat my invitation to people who are listening. If you've got a subject that you'd like to hear about, just email me or email Angela, and I'll be sure to try to research it and do a presentation on it for another time. There's a million different subjects of interest that are floating around the world today, both political type of subjects and environmental ones, economic ones, cultural ones, and I'm open to all kinds of suggestions.
So, Mr. Dwoskin, I see that Aviva wants to ask a question. Aviva, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, you have to unmute yourself at the top of the of your screen. You have to press that little unmute button.
Okay, can you hear?
Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to ask what the situation of the Jewish people is in Ukraine now.
What the situation is.
Of the Jewish people in Ukraine, they were once a very strong, big community.
Well, in general, they're not. One thing is for sure, they're not surprised by this action of Putin. They've been sort of living under Soviet and Russian domination since 1921. They suffered tremendously in the Second World War, losing millions of people, and not just the Jewish population, but millions of other ones. They were kind of second cousins to the Russians, and they're happy being an independent country. Now, it really is kind of up to Putin to decide what he wants. He could, if he wanted to, march Russian troops right into Kiev and take over the whole country. So he could do that, but he knows that if he did that, 90% of the Ukrainians would be against it. He would be like an occupying force. It would cost them tremendous amounts of blood and money. And what would be the purpose of it in a certain sense? So for Putin, he's much a bully, which is what he is, never really likes to fight. They just like to intimidate. And I think that's where Putin is right at this moment. I don't think, once he actually sends troops into the Ukraine proper, because right now he's just sent them into those so-called self-governing pro-Russian republics, which have basically been controlled by Russia, as I said, since 2004, I think. Yeah, I forget when did I say it was. But, they have been sort of under Russian rule for, at least a dozen years already. So, strategically, then things haven't changed, but symbolically they have, because that is Ukrainian territory that Russia has now put their foot in. And no country has recognized the so-called these people's republics. So by definition, that means that every country recognizes that Russia now has forces on foreign soil. The Ukrainians are ready for a confrontation with Russia. They know what Russia is all about, and they also, at this point, seem quite united. The government seems to be quite united and doing a half-decent job mobilizing the sort of morale of the people. They held a kind of a unification day last week where people were walking around with flags and singing songs and all that kind of thing. And, so it's up to Putin to decide how far he wants to push it.
Okay, there's Steve, please unmute yourself and ask your question to Mr. Dwoskin.
Hi, Steve. Thank you, Aviva.
Okay, hi Hershey, you're able to hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, so to me, it looks like, nobody wants to fight a world war over Ukraine. The rest of the Europeans aren't willing to really step up and all that. Okay, so fine. So there isn't going to be any major confrontations, military confrontations over Ukraine. But what does China take away from this with regards to Taiwan? I think that's where the real danger is.
Yeah,
What is China saying? What is Iran saying? And North Korea. Now, Iran and North Korea to a lesser degree than China. But what is China's calculus from all this?
Yeah, that's a super good point. I was reading about that today. It seems, now I don't know if it's true or not, that China asked Russia not to invade during the Olympics in order to, take attention away from the Olympics. And China might think that if the world does not answer to the Russians in Ukraine, it won't answer to the Chinese taking over Taiwan. But obviously the two situations are really very, very different. They certainly are different in the sense that the US has guaranteed Taiwan's independence, number one, that the Taiwanese forces have huge military arsenal behind them that is sophisticated, that is, ready to fight. One of the weapons I think that we didn't mention yet is this whole cyber weapon, and what Russia could certainly do and has tried already, to bring down the infrastructure of the Ukraine by cyber attacks. So that's a serious thing, and to do the same thing to the rest of the world, should they be objecting to what the Russians are doing. China has never been closer to Russia, until now. Putin and Xi are sort of, we'll call them both autocrats, both think a lot of themselves, both leaders of powerful countries. But Russia, on the other hand, is not as important to China as vice versa. So Russia needs China more than China needs Russia. And, the sort of general weakening and disorganization of the West is something that China can look at and say, you know what, we don't have to be so afraid of them, because look at, they won't stand up to Russia. So they may not stand up to us, but the people of Taiwan for sure would. And I think if China tried a military invasion of Taiwan, I think the demand in the United States would be to send military forces, if not land troops, but certainly, aircraft and all that to try to fight off the Chinese.
Okay, I sort of see Taiwan as a more dangerous prospect than Ukraine, because in Asia we also have Japan. What will Japan do? Australia, and even the Americans with navigation of the seas, free navigation, freedom of navigation of the seas around Taiwan.
America, the difference is that America has actual agreements with Taiwan that they would defend Taiwan, and that they didn't have any kind of agreement like that with the Ukraine, so they're not bound to do it. And no European country had an agreement with the Ukraine to defend them. So that's why, like you said, the stakes would be a lot higher should China try to invade Taiwan. And they've managed so far by diplomatically isolating Taiwan on the one hand, but between China and Taiwan, there's an enormous amount of business that's going on, a huge amount of investment, a huge amount of jobs. And I don't think that either country wants to change that situation.
How would America, particularly under a weak leadership, make it known? I guess it would be, diplomatically through back channels that look, Taiwan is not the Ukraine. Don't try anything.
Well, I mean, they could certainly try to get that message across, but China knows it already. And like I was saying, this company Foxconn, which assembles pretty well everything, they have 1 million employees in China. That's a Taiwanese company, and it's the largest foreign employer in China. So, China would have to be taking quite a risk to try to just one day decide to send all their forces in and take over the country, because they would have a lot more to lose than they would have to gain in that way.
And Hershey, with regards to Ukraine, do you think that it was a mistake that the Americans pulled out their embassy staff so fast? Don't you think that they should have left them there?
I don't know. No, I really don't know. I heard Israel did the same thing. They moved their embassy to Lvov.
I can understand, some of the support staff, family and whatnot, but to just, pull out so quickly, the optics of that are terrible.
I agree with you, because, the optics of what they did in Afghanistan was terrible, even though, it was written on the wall that they were leaving, long before they actually left. When a country pulls its embassy or shuts its embassy down, it gives the host country the feeling that they're being abandoned. Right. And that's not a great feeling for the country to have. And theoretically, why would the Americans do that? Like, their staff is not in danger staying in Kiev. Even let's say, had the Russians invaded, they wouldn't have done anything to the American staff in the embassy there. Right. Going back to Iran, that was different. Remember, in Iran after the revolution, they actually did take hostages and prisoners of the American staff in Tehran. But I mean, the situation is not the same. It not even close to being the same.
Yeah.
Not the optics, like you said, are not good.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much, Hershey.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. Thanks for listening.
You're welcome.
So, Mr. Dwoskin, there is a comment here by Hannah. It says, the Jewish Russians or the Jewish Ukrainians are not very fond of Ukraine. So I don't find it surprising that they are in agreement about the Russian invasion.
No, the Jewish community living in the Ukraine today is very pro-Ukrainian. They are supporting the government there, they live in a free country, so they can kind of say what they want and do what they want. The Jews living in Russia itself are not living in a free country, and they have to be careful of what they're doing. There've actually been some public demonstrations in Russia against the invasion of the Ukraine. But the people who do those demonstrations really are taking a risk of getting themselves thrown in jail. Like I was saying before, in Israel, there's huge, and I mean enormous, 1 million plus Ukrainian and Russian expat communities who live there. And what unites them is they all don't want to see fighting going on in Europe. The Russian government has actually made quite a lot of effort to sponsor Russian media to be available in Russian for the Russian-speaking Israelis. And there are a lot of people in Israel who have strong sympathetic feelings to Putin among the Russian Jewish community there. You know, but there hasn't been a kind of a, let's call it a mini civil war in Israel between Jewish Ukrainians and Jewish Russians. That hasn't happened. Anything else?
I don't see anything else, Mr. Dwoskin.
Okay, so thanks everybody. Thank Angela. Thank everybody for listening, for tuning in, for participating, and please come back next Tuesday. We'll have a different subject to talk about, a different discussion to have, and you know, I wish you all a happy 2022. So we'll see you all next week. Bye.
Thank you, Mr. Dwoskin, and thank you to everyone listening in over the telephone and through Zoom. We shall see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.